Part 1. The empty porch. The wooden porch groaned beneath the weight of time. Warped slats curled at the corners. Chipped paint peeled like shedding skin. And rust crept along the nails that held the old bones together. Every morning, as the horizon blushed with the first rays of sun, the same sound echoed across the dirt path. The faint click of claws. Shadow stepped onto the porch like a soldier reporting for duty. He didn't bark. He didn't pace. He sat. Front paws squared, back straight, ears up, alert. The wind tugged gently at the loose fur around his neck. He didn't acknowledge it. His gaze locked onto the same stretch of road he had stared at for over 6 years. The road from which no one had returned. The road he refused to believe had taken his partner for good. They called him retired. They called him broken. They didn't understand. He was waiting. The small town of Ridgeline was used to the sight. Every morning, like clockwork, the black German shepherd appeared on the porch of a sagging house that no one had entered in years. The home had once belonged to Detective Jake Monroe, the town's quiet protector, a man who had seen war and chose justice. 6 years ago, he'd vanished in an undercover operation gone wrong. Only Shadow made it back. The police claimed the raid turned into an ambush. A building had burned to ashes. A syndicate scattered like roaches. Jake's body was never recovered. They held a memorial with an empty casket. Medals were awarded. Speeches given. But Shadow knew better. He had been there. He remembered the scent of betrayal. The gunshots. The heat of fire. The scream Jake made before it all went silent. Shadow returned, half-burned and limping. And every day since, he sat on that porch. Watching. Waiting. On a gray Monday, clouds swollen with promise but holding back rain, Maya Torres eased her aging Corolla up the dusty road toward the forgotten house. The tires kicked up puffs of powdery gravel that drifted through the air like spirits too lazy to haunt. She parked beneath a crooked pine, killed the engine, and sat in silence. Her fingers drummed against the steering wheel. There he was, just as described, upright, silent, unflinching. She'd heard rumors, threads on obscure blogs, forums for local legends, a Facebook group titled, "He Still Waits." At first, it had felt like folklore, a loyal dog refusing to accept death. But then came the photo. Shadow, aged and proud, still sitting like a statue of grief carved in fur and flesh. Maya's instincts, sharp as ever, buzzed with the weight of untold truth. She grabbed her notebook, camera, and a file of clippings, then stepped out into the wind. "Hey, Shadow," she whispered, her voice barely disturbing the air. No movement. She approached slowly, each step careful. At the foot of the porch, she paused, crouching slightly to match his eye level. "I know you don't know me, but I think you remember him," she said, reaching into her bag and unfolding a photo. It was old, faded, a printout of a recent mugshot from a neighboring state. The man's features were obscured by a beard, one eye swollen shut, but the shape of the jaw, the tilt of the nose, they mirrored Jake Monroe. Shadow didn't blink, didn't turn, but his nose twitched. Then a low sound, like a breath caught between growl and whimper, escaped his throat. Maya felt her chest tighten. "You know him, don't you?" she murmured. Shadow's head tilted slightly, his eyes now locked on hers. The porch creaked. She didn't try to touch him. She simply left the photo at the edge of the step, along with a piece of jerky from her bag. Then she walked back to her car, trying not to glance over her shoulder. As she drove off, Shadow stood. For the first time in years, he sniffed the photo, whined, nudged it gently, like he was trying to wake it. Then he turned, looked down the road, and howled. A single, drawn-out note that sliced through the morning like a memory resurfacing. That afternoon, Maya visited the Ridgeline Police Department. The building was modest. Red brick, cracked foundation, flags that barely fluttered in the lazy wind. Inside, the air was still heavy with that stale mix of old paper and disinfectant. At the front desk sat Sergeant Daniel Keller, gray at the temples, his uniform pressed to regulation perfection. "Can I help you?" he asked, eyes barely lifting from the folder on his desk. "I'm looking into the Jake Monroe case," Maya said. "And Shadow." The air shifted. Keller's eyes narrowed. "There is no case. Monroe died in the line of duty. Hero's send-off. You can check the archive." "No body," Maya countered.
No confirmation.
"Just a fire and a disappearance." He folded his arms. "Miss Torres, Maya Torres, independent journalist. That explains the digging. I think there's more here. That photo I left with Shadow." He reacted. Keller sighed deeply. "You want a story, I get it. But Jake's gone. We honored him. Now let it rest." "I don't think he's dead," Maya said softly. "And I don't think Shadow does either." He stood, placing his palms on the desk. "Some people stay in denial because it's easier than grief. Don't mistake loyalty for a clue. Loyalty doesn't last 6 years on a porch," Maya said, turning away. She stopped at a diner just outside town for coffee and a moment to breathe. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, brought her a refill without being asked. "Don't see many strangers around here," the woman said. "I'm here for the dog," Maya said absently. The woman smiled sadly. "Shadow, sweet soul, never caused trouble. Used to bring him bacon scraps back when Jake was alive." Maya leaned in. "Did Jake ever talk about enemies? Fears?" The woman's smile faded. "Jake wasn't the talking type, but he always looked over his shoulder, like he knew someone was coming." That night, Maya returned to her apartment to find the door slightly ajar. Her heartbeat stuttered. She pushed the door open gently, holding her keys like a weapon. Inside, everything looked in place except for her laptop. The screen was glowing. A new tab open. A headline stared back at her. "Whistleblower claims cover-up in Ridgeline police raid." Date: 6 years ago. The article had been removed from most archives, hidden behind firewalls. But someone had left it for her. Her hands shook as she hit record on her audio notes. "Something's wrong. Monroe's case wasn't clean. Someone's watching. Someone wants this found, or they want to scare me." The next morning, Maya returned to the house. Shadow was already off the porch, standing, waiting for her. She opened the car door. "Want to come?" He didn't hesitate. He climbed in. They drove through winding hills, past fields kissed by fog. Shadow occasionally growled at nothing. At intersections, he seemed to react when she turned left instead of right. She let him lead. They ended up outside a worn-out storage facility. Rows of metal doors, most rusted shut. The clerk barely looked up as she walked in. "I'm here for Unit 304, Maya said, holding up a slip of paper. The man handed her a keycard. "Belonged to a J. Monroe. Rent's been paid in full every year." The unit opened with a hiss. Dust danced in shafts of morning light. Inside were files, photos, boxes labeled with case numbers, and pinned maps of Ridgeline and surrounding counties. A corkboard held a spiderweb of red thread connecting mugshots to addresses. Newspaper clippings, Polaroids. In the center, a photo of Jake and Shadow. Below it, taped to the wall, a USB drive. Maya pocketed it. Shadow approached a metal trunk. He pawed it once. She opened it slowly, revealing a worn-out journal. The first page read, "If this is found, I didn't make it home. But Shadow did. And Shadow remembers what they want you to forget." Maya sat down on the cold cement floor, heart pounding. She glanced at the dog beside her, his head resting on her knee. "You've been waiting all this time," she whispered. "But maybe it wasn't just for Jake. Maybe it was for justice." Shadow closed his eyes but didn't move. Outside, thunder cracked in the distance. A storm was coming. Part 2. The last mission. He remembered everything. The gunshots, the scent of betrayal, the voice he'd never hear again. Or so he thought. The contents of the storage unit felt like a shrine built from paranoia and unfinished justice. Maya stared at the old corkboard, her breath shallow. She traced the lines of red yarn with her eyes, connecting mugshots to case files, dates to addresses, victims to suspects. And in the very center, a photo of Detective Jake Monroe, standing beside Shadow, both proud and alive. The ink had faded, but their bond glowed through the image. Beside her, Shadow sat perfectly still, his head cocked slightly. His ears twitched as if catching sounds only memory could hear. She took the USB and slipped it into her laptop, the screen flickering for a second before revealing a folder labeled Kraken. Inside were logs, photos, voice memos, and a video file named simply last_mission_final.mp4. Maya clicked play. The screen lit up with shaky footage. Jake Monroe appeared in a dimly lit room, a tactical vest slung over one shoulder, blood on his temple. His voice, low and hoarse, crackled through the speakers. "This is Detective Jake Monroe. If you're watching this, it means I didn't make it home." He looked straight into the lens. "They call it Project Kraken. But it's not just a drug ring. It's infiltration. The syndicate embedded itself deep, cops, judges, politicians. I went in undercover. Too deep." Shadow stirred beside her, whining softly as Jake's voice continued. "Shadow made it out. He knows who to trust. If he leads you here, you're already part of the answer. But don't trust anyone in uniform. Not even the chief. Especially not the chief." He paused. "They'll try to bury this. Like they tried to bury me." The screen glitched, then froze. Maya sat motionless, her skin crawling. She turned to Shadow. "So, Jake knew. He knew he wouldn't get out." Shadow barked once, sharp and low. "What do I do with this?" she whispered, clutching the USB. "How do I prove it?" Shadow stood and nudged a box near the corner. Inside, more notebooks, evidence photos, burnt ID cards. One was a police badge, melted around the edges but still legible.
Monroe, J. Ridgeline PD.
She thumbed through a file labeled Sleeper Protocol. It outlined key names, suspected insiders, bank transfers, surveillance logs. But one name was underlined multiple times. Keller. Maya's heart slammed against her ribs. Sergeant Keller. The man who told her to drop the story. The one who seemed too eager to bury Monroe's memory. Jake had known. Had left this trail in case someone ever followed. And now Maya had a target. Back in town, Maya stopped at a gas station and bought a burner phone. She used it to upload the Kraken file to a private cloud, encrypting it with a password only she would remember. As she drove, her eyes constantly checked the mirror. Was she being followed? Shadow, now fully alert, kept his head near the passenger window, occasionally releasing a quiet growl whenever a car got too close. She pulled into a roadside motel that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the 80s. Room 6 smelled like mildew and cigarettes, but the lock worked. She placed a chair under the doorknob and sat cross-legged on the bed with her laptop in front of her. Time to dig deeper. She opened the Kraken folder again. This time, she played the second video. Jake stood at a chalkboard covered in names. Keller, Warren, Pollock. They're the core. Judges and cops. The syndicate uses them to reroute investigations, bury files, delay prosecutions. I got close. Too close. He looked down, face hardening. They tried to kill me twice. First was the car bomb. Second time, the fire. I faked the third. He smirked bitterly. Burned my own badge. Left it in the warehouse. Shadow was trained to escape on cue. He did. I stayed. Maya's breath caught. Jake hadn't died. He had disappeared on purpose. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she cross-referenced the names in the file with local records. She found shell companies, empty lots, untraceable donations to election campaigns, all tied back to people Jake had named. One detail stood out. A small warehouse 40 miles out of town, rented under the name Jasper Trading Company. A front. The lease was paid annually in cash. The building had no listed activity. No traffic.
No surveillance.
Shadow growled the moment she said the name aloud. You know it, she whispered. He barked once. By dawn, she had made her decision. They were going to the warehouse. The drive was quiet. Too quiet. They passed abandoned farms, broken fences, rusted trucks swallowed by tall grass. The warehouse sat behind a grove of trees, camouflaged by nature's neglect. Vines coiled around its exterior like veins wrapping a dead heart. Maya parked half a mile away and approached on foot, Shadow leading the way. His body moved like a professional, low to the ground, ears rotating, nose twitching with every breath. He stopped at the side entrance, pawed the door. It was unlocked. Inside, the warehouse was empty. At first glance, dust coated the floor, but Maya spotted scuff marks near the far wall, tracks that didn't match the age of the rest of the building. She followed them. Shadow stood frozen at a corner. A false panel. She pushed it. The wall creaked open to reveal a hidden stairwell. Her pulse thundered in her ears. They descended into darkness, her flashlight slicing through cobwebs and decades of dust. At the bottom was a single room, crude, but livable. A cot, empty food cans, propane stove, and a makeshift desk stacked with maps, tapes, and one framed photo. Jake and Shadow, framed in sunlight. Her knees buckled. He had been here. Shadow sniffed the cot, then let out a sound Maya hadn't heard before. Not a bark, not a whimper, something like mourning. Suddenly, Shadow tensed. He faced the stairwell, ears flat, teeth bared. Footsteps. Maya backed into the shadows, clutching a steel rod she'd found near the wall. Then the voice came, low, ragged. Who are you? A figure appeared in the stairwell light, tall, bearded, wearing a worn-out jacket with a ridgeline badge sewn on the arm. Maya gasped. It was Jake. He looked older, scarred, one eye swollen shut, a long limp in his step. But it was him. Shadow leapt forward, his bark filled with longing. Jake fell to his knees as Shadow pushed into him, tail thumping wildly. Jake wrapped his arms around the dog, eyes wet. Good boy. You made it. Maya stepped forward slowly. You're alive, she whispered. Jake looked up. You shouldn't have come. I had to, she said. You left a trail. He shook his head. No, I left insurance. You weren't supposed to find it. I wasn't the one who found it, she said, nodding at Shadow. He led me. Jake looked down at the dog and smiled faintly. Always knew you were smarter than me. They sat in silence for several minutes. Then Maya asked the question she had come to ask. Why stay hidden? Jake's expression darkened. They were watching. I didn't know who to trust. Keller was in too deep. If I came back, they'd finish what they started. But now we have proof, she said. We can expose them. Jake turned to her, eyes tired. Proof won't matter if they kill you before you can use it. I've already uploaded the files, she said. It's out there now. Jake stared at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Then it's time. They packed everything from the bunker, drives, maps, the journal. Maya called in a favor from an old editor who owed her. A digital drop was arranged. A live press stream. The kind of thing that couldn't be stopped once it began. Jake changed into his old uniform, tattered but still holding the weight of justice. He clipped on his badge, now warped and blackened. Shadow sat beside him, alert and ready. Maya snapped a photo, Jake and Shadow side by side again. Her final caption before going live. The truth never died. It was waiting. Part 3. The dog who knows too much. Jake Monroe stared into the dusty mirror of the bunker. The glass cracked down its center like a fracture running through time. The man staring back was familiar, but only barely. His eyes were darker than they'd ever been, one rimmed with a scar that cut through his brow. The reflection didn't show the man who used to walk tall through the Ridgeline precinct. Badge polished, uniform crisp, confidence solid. No, this man was forged from silence and ash, haunted by betrayal, and too many years in the dark. He buttoned the final clasp of his jacket. Shadow lay at his feet, tail thumping softly, gaze fixed on the mirror. Jake looked down and gave a dry smile. Still with me? Shadow barked quietly, his voice low and sure. Upstairs, Maya paced. The warehouse above the bunker had been silent for the past hour. Her phone buzzed once. An encrypted notification from her editor. Leo, going live in 48 hours. Files secure. You sure about this? She typed back quickly. Jake's ready. The dog knew before any of us. We follow him. She put the phone down, heart rattling. She still wasn't sure if what she was doing was fearless or foolish. Jake emerged from the stairwell, moving slowly, but his presence had changed. Gone was the ghost who lived underground. The way he walked now, his spine straighter, his steps firmer. This was the detective who once commanded task forces and made criminals sweat. He had returned. That evening, Maya, Jake, and Shadow drove back toward Ridgeline, avoiding highways. The road was long. The sky painted a bruised orange that bled into indigo as night approached. Jake sat quietly in the passenger seat, his fingers resting against the worn notebook he hadn't let out of his sight. I read your notes, Maya said. You suspected Keller from the beginning. Jake nodded slowly. He used to be clean, a good cop. But something changed after his son got into trouble. Drugs, gambling, bad company. The syndicate offered him a way out. You think they turned him? I know they did. Shadow let out a low growl. Jake's hand moved reflexively to the back of the dog's neck. He's got a sense for that name. Keller. Always did. They stopped at an abandoned motel on the outskirts of a ghost town. It was run down, windows shattered, paint flaked from the doors. Jake insisted they stay one night off the grid, just in case. Inside, Jake unrolled his maps again, circling locations. He pointed to a spot on the ridgeline perimeter. This is where it started, he said. The warehouse they burned. The night Shadow came back alone. Maya looked up. You said he saw everything, but you never told me what that meant. Jake exhaled, voice turning to gravel. Shadow was trained to identify targets, sense, behavior, emotions. On that night, we were supposed to take down a mid-level enforcer named Mason Kilroy. But when we entered the building, I smelled gasoline. Shadow barked a warning, but it was already too late. He paused. They set the place on fire with me inside. Shadow bit one of them, tore clean through his thigh, and dragged me halfway out before I gave him the escape command. Go home. It was our last resort code. And he did, Maya whispered. He waited every day after. Jake nodded, because he knew I wasn't dead, and he knew who had tried to kill me. Later that night, Jake opened a steel box from the bunker and pulled out a cloth-wrapped bundle. Inside, Shadow's original training vest, still stained, straps frayed but intact. He held it out. Shadow sniffed it, then stepped forward, lifting one paw, then the other, as Jake buckled him in. The dog's posture changed, proud, alert, a soldier once more. Time to work, Jake said quietly. The next day, they reached Ridgeline just before noon. They didn't go to the police station. Instead, they went to the Riverside Veterinary Hospital, the one place they knew Shadow had once felt safe. The clinic was run by Dr. Ellie Price, a soft-spoken woman who had treated Shadow after the fire and kept quiet about the burns, the trauma, the scars. When she saw Jake walk through the door, her clipboard fell to the floor. Jake? She breathed. He nodded. I need a favor. Ellie led them to the back room. Jake and Maya laid out the evidence, photos, logs, surveillance images. Shadow sat beside the table, eyes flicking to every door. Ellie stared at the files in disbelief. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't know how deep it went. We go public in 48 hours, Maya said. But Keller and the others, they won't wait. We need to make them show their hand. Jake unrolled a final photo, one of a man in a security uniform standing beside Keller in a dark alley. The man had a jagged scar running across his jaw. Maya recognized him immediately. That's the guy Shadow reacted to when I first showed him the mugshot. The photo I found online. He's the trigger. Jake nodded. His name is Leon Briggs. Ex-military. Now muscle for hire. He's Keller's enforcer. He's in town? Ellie asked. Rumor says he is. And if Shadow sees him again, we might just get the reaction we need. That evening, they took Shadow to a local park. Jake carried a discreet GoPro, and Maya stood by with a hidden mic. It was risky but necessary. If Briggs was watching, he'd follow Shadow. That was the plan. It didn't take long. A black SUV pulled up across the street. A man stepped out, face partially obscured by a cap and sunglasses. But the limp gave him away. Shadow's body stiffened. His hackles rose. He growled low, like thunder rolling across gravel. Jake nodded. That's him. Briggs made a call on his burner. Seconds later, Keller emerged from a nearby bench. Plain clothes, but unmistakable. Maya whispered, "You were right." Jake spoke calmly into the mic. "This is Detective Monroe, confirming visual ID of Sergeant Daniel Keller and Leon Briggs. Engaged in surveillance. Shadow confirmed scent recognition. This is our proof." They walked away slowly. Shadow didn't look back. That night, back at the motel, Jake finally sat down with Maya one-on-one. They were tired, worn thin by nerves, but their minds raced ahead of the storm. "You think they'll move on us tonight?" Maya asked. "They might," Jake said, "but I've left trails. Dropped hints in just the right places." "What does that mean?" Jake looked at her and, for the first time, smiled. Not bitter, but real. "It means by morning, the syndicate will think they've found me." At 3:37 a.m., Shadow leapt to the window and barked once, short and warning. Headlights swept across the parking lot. 2 black cars pulled in fast. 4 men stepped out, one of them unmistakably Keller. Maya looked at Jake. "It's happening." He handed her a flash drive. "Get out the back. Upload this to Leo if anything happens." "What about you?" "I have Shadow." She opened her mouth to protest. Jake's eyes told her this wasn't up for debate. She slipped out the bathroom window just as the first knock hit the door. Inside, Jake faced the door with Shadow by his side. Keller's voice came through. "Jake, we just want to talk." "You set me up," Jake replied. "You tried to burn me alive. Let's not be dramatic. I've got evidence. It's going live." A pause. Then, "That's a mistake." Shadow growled again. Outside, Maya ducked behind a truck, phone in hand. She whispered into the mic. "Live footage activated. They're here." Her phone buzzed. Leo had gone live. She turned the camera toward the door, just in time to catch Keller kicking it open. Inside, Jake stood calmly. Keller raised his weapon. Last chance. Shadow launched. In seconds, chaos erupted. Guns drawn. Shouts. Furniture overturned. Shadow tore into Briggs before he could fire. Jake ducked as a bullet grazed the wall. Maya streamed the whole thing live to thousands. The truth wasn't hidden anymore. Sirens arrived minutes later. Real officers. State police. By the time the dust settled, Keller and Briggs were in cuffs. Shadow stood over them, tail stiff, gaze unblinking. Jake stepped outside, bloodied but alive. Reporters were already arriving. Maya turned to the camera, her voice steady. "This is the truth Ridgeline tried to bury. But a dog never forgets. And today he brought a town back to justice." Part 4. The file Jake left behind. Some truths survive in shadows. Others are buried until someone dares to unearth them. The morning after the arrests, Ridgeline was unrecognizable. The small, quiet town that once hid its secrets under layers of polite silence was now buzzing with sirens, reporters, news vans, and voices filled with disbelief. Everyone was talking about the fire 6 years ago, about the betrayal in the police department, and most of all about the man who came back from the dead, and the dog who never stopped waiting. Maya stood at the edge of the sidewalk, watching the chaos unfold. Jake sat on the hospital bench beside her, bandaged around the shoulder. Shadow lay at his feet, eyes open, tail flicking every so often as if still listening for danger. It was only hours since they'd broadcast the confrontation live. Keller and Briggs had been taken into custody, their faces plastered across every screen. The evidence was out. The story was viral. But the fight was far from over. "They're going to try to spin it," Jake said, voice low. "Say I went rogue, that I was unstable." Maya turned to him. "They can try. But the footage, your journal, your file." Jake's eyes met hers. "That's the thing. You haven't found all of it yet." 2 hours later, they returned to the bunker, now under state police protection. Maya had insisted on it. Whatever else was down there, it had to be found before someone else got to it. Jake moved slower this time. His body was stiff from the hospital visit, but his mind was sharper than ever. Shadow stayed close, occasionally sniffing the air, ears twitching. In the corner, behind an old heater, Jake lifted a loose floorboard. Beneath it lay a rusted metal briefcase, double-locked. He placed it on the table and pulled a key from around his neck. Click. Inside were 3 items: a leather-bound folder with the initials JM, a worn cassette tape, unlabeled, a blood-stained flash drive labeled Final Witness. Jake opened the folder first. Maya leaned in, reading over his shoulder. The file was titled Internal Affairs, Phase 3 Targets Embedded Within. The names were familiar now: Keller, Briggs, Warren. But a few hadn't been in the earlier evidence drop. Jake pointed at one. Chief Sandra Leclerc, current chief of police, Ridgeline PD. "She came in after I disappeared," Jake said. "Played the grief card. Claimed she was honoring my legacy." Maya frowned. "You think she's syndicate too?" Jake nodded. "She's the final key. The one who replaced me." Maya's blood ran cold. "If she's part of it, she'll move fast." Jake opened the notebook tucked beneath the folder. On the first page, "If you're reading this, I didn't just disappear. I was erased. By them. They used my disappearance to promote her. The syndicate needed someone to keep the fire out. She did more than that. She built a wall around it." Maya snapped photos of every page, uploading them directly to her encrypted folder. Then she picked up the flash drive. The screen flickered to life. On the drive was a single folder, labeled Witness 312 Cassidy Wren. Maya clicked it. A video opened. A woman, mid-30s, sat in a dimly lit room, visibly nervous. Her hands trembled as she held a glass of water. The timestamp was 6 years old. Jake's voice from off-screen asked, "Can you state your name for the record?" "Cassidy Wren," the woman whispered. "Who do you work for?" There was a pause. "I was a civilian contractor for the Ridgeline Evidence Archive Division. I handled incoming logs from sealed cases." "Tell us what you saw." Cassidy swallowed hard. "I saw Keller sign off on a file marked closed, even though the suspect was never arrested. The file contained records from a raid, one that never happened. It had Monroe's name and a death certificate attached before the fire." Maya leaned closer to the screen, stunned. Cassidy continued, voice cracking. "I asked questions. I was told to forget. The next week, my apartment was broken into. My cat was killed. I got the message." Jake's voice again. "Why are you speaking now?" "Because if I don't, no one will." The video ended. Maya sat back, heart racing. This proves they forged your death before the fire. It was premeditated." Jake nodded. "And that woman? She disappeared 3 weeks after this recording. Never seen again." Maya's hands tightened around the laptop. "Then this isn't just about corruption. It's about murder." Outside, Shadow barked once. Maya and Jake jumped. "Someone's coming," Jake said, grabbing the briefcase and tucking it under his arm. They exited the bunker just as 2 unmarked sedans pulled up to the gate. But it wasn't syndicate muscle. It was the state attorney general's task force. A woman in a sharp gray suit stepped out. Detective Monroe. Miss Torres.
I'm Rachel Voss.
You just made the state's most wanted list twice. Jake raised a brow. I've missed being popular. She smiled slightly. We'd like to debrief you. And we're placing the Ridgeline Department under state control effective immediately. Maya turned to Jake. It's working. He glanced down at Shadow. We're not done yet. 2 days later, at a press conference on the Ridgeline courthouse steps, Jake stood with Maya, Shadow at his heel. Dozens of reporters crowded in. Cameras clicked. The sun shone through a gap in the clouds, casting a spotlight over the podium. Jake stepped forward. My name is Detective Jake Monroe. I was declared dead 6 years ago. That was a lie. Gasps rippled through the crowd. He continued. I was betrayed by my own. I went undercover to expose a criminal syndicate that had infected law enforcement. When I got too close, they tried to kill me. And they left my dog for dead. Shadow barked once. They underestimated us both. Jake lifted the folder marked Final Witness and handed it to the Attorney General. This is every name, every file, every cover-up, every innocent person who paid the price. He looked at Maya. And if not for this woman, and this dog, you wouldn't be hearing this. Applause broke out. Reporters surged forward. But Jake wasn't done. He leaned into the mic. And one more thing. I never stopped being a cop. And I'm not done. That night, back at Maya's apartment, the three of them sat in silence. For once, there was no rush, no danger, no chase. Just quiet. Shadow lay curled between them, finally at rest. Maya glanced at Jake. What now? Jake looked out the window, his voice steady. We follow the rest of the names. One by one. Maya smirked. You know, we'd make a hell of a team. Jake's eyes met hers. We already are. Part 5. Hunted. The truth was finally out. But some enemies don't wait for the law to catch up. They come in the dark. And they don't knock. The knock came at 2:19 a.m. 3 short raps. Too deliberate to be a neighbor. Too bold for a stranger. Jake was already awake. He had been sitting in the living room of Maya's small apartment. The lights off, Shadow at his feet, ears alert. Jake's eyes hadn't left the front door in hours. He knew they would come. He just didn't know when. Shadow stood now, tail stiff, body tense. No growl, just silence. A soldier trained to respond to threat, not to fear. Jake reached for his sidearm. It wasn't regulation, but it was reliable. He motioned to Maya's bedroom door. She opened it before he could say a word, holding her phone, already recording. Her face was pale, but her hands steady. They're early, she whispered. They're desperate, Jake replied. He moved to the door and looked through the peephole. 2 men in black stood outside, one tall and broad-shouldered, the other wiry and pale, eyes obscured by a baseball cap. Neither of them looked like local law enforcement.
No badges. No uniforms.
Just silence and wait. Shadow growled low now. The sound was like gravel sliding over steel. Jake opened the door. Just an inch. Can I help you? He said coolly. The bigger man didn't blink. Jake Monroe. Depends who's asking. The wiry one smiled. You know who sent us. Jake nodded once, then slammed the door. They didn't knock again. Instead, the taller one kicked it hard. Jake pulled Maya down just as the door burst open, splinters flying. Shadow lunged. The narrow hallway exploded into chaos. Growls, shouts, fists slamming into drywall. Maya crawled behind the sofa, dialing the emergency line. This is Maya Torres. I'm under attack. 119 Pulaski Street. 2 armed men. One of the intruders drew a knife, but Shadow bit first. The blade fell. Jake tackled the man to the ground, knee driving into his spine. The second intruder raised a gun, but hesitated when Shadow turned on him, teeth dripping. Police sirens wailed in the distance, faster than expected. The gunman bolted. The man under Jake groaned. Shadow didn't let go. 10 minutes later, the apartment was a war zone. Broken glass, blood on the linoleum, a deep gash across Jake's temple. Maya's desk overturned, files scattered like fallen soldiers. Shadow stood guard by the restrained man, still growling. State police arrived, guns drawn, armor tight, faces hard. Jake raised his hands. One intruder escaped. This one's yours. The man was identified as Clayton Red, ex-Special Forces, dishonorably discharged, suspected of being a syndicate enforcer. I told you, Jake whispered to Maya as paramedics cleaned his cut. They're not done. They're just getting started. The next day, Maya's apartment was under 24-hour protection. But the mood had shifted. What had started as a story, then a confession, was now a war. Jake met with Rachel Voss from the state attorney's office in a temporary command center downtown. Maps were pinned to every wall. Case files stacked waist-high. Voss didn't mince words. Monroe, you've stirred up a hornet's nest. Jake folded his arms. It needed stirring. Clayton Red won't talk. He's a wall. He doesn't need to. The other guy, the runner, he was scared. Shadow could smell it. You think you can find him? Jake nodded. With the right trail. And Shadow's nose. Voss glanced at Maya, who stood quietly in the corner, reviewing security footage. She's your partner now? Jake looked at Maya. She's the reason I'm alive. They reviewed the footage frame by frame. The runner's face was blurry, but not untraceable. He wore a unique patch on his jacket, 3 diagonal lines with a serpent's head. Jake narrowed his eyes. Syndicate tattoo. Low rank. Street muscle. Voss leaned in. So they're not sending their best? Not yet, but they will. Maya added. The attack happened before we even released the full second drop. Voss frowned. Second drop. Jake opened his briefcase. Inside, a second drive. This one names out-of-state contacts. The syndicate doesn't stop in Ridgeline. That night, they moved to a safe house. It was an old ranger station in the forest used by state police years ago. Remote, off-grid, surrounded by wilderness. Jake, Maya, and Shadow settled in, tense, exhausted, but focused. Around a campfire outside the cabin, Jake finally spoke. 6 years ago, I was close. Tracked their shipments, infiltrated their shell corporations. I had names. Then the order came down from the top. Terminate with prejudice. Who gave it? Maya asked. Jake looked into the flames. We don't know yet, but someone above Leclerc. Shadow shifted beside them, ears twitching. I think, Jake said slowly, they were using Ridgeline as a pilot. A test city? Maya asked. Jake nodded. Bleed it dry. Control the cops. Own the courts. And then, expand. The following morning, Shadow woke them both with a bark. Jake shot upright. What is it? Shadow pawed the door, then bolted into the trees. Maya threw on her jacket and followed. Jake grabbed his weapon and trailed after her. They found Shadow at the edge of a cliff overlooking the valley. In the distance, 2 SUVs climbing the mountain road. Jake raised his binoculars. They found us. They had 10 minutes, maybe less. Jake and Maya packed the files. Shadow ran a perimeter check, then returned, panting, gaze locked on the tree line. They didn't run. They prepared. The SUVs stopped at the trailhead. 5 men emerged, heavily armed. Syndicate marks on their sleeves. Jake crouched low. They're not here to talk. Maya took a deep breath. Then let's make sure they regret coming. Jake looked at Shadow. Ready. Shadow barked once. Sharp. Fierce. The same bark he gave before a raid. The forest erupted in motion. Jake moved through the trees like a ghost, flanking the lead attacker. 1 down. Maya stayed near the cabin, filming everything, shouting coordinates over the radio. Shadow intercepted 2 more, slamming into them like a black missile. Teeth and training.
No hesitasten.
But there were too many. Jake was tackled near the riverbend. His gun skittered away. A boot hit his ribs. Shadow heard the struggle, turned mid-fight, and ran. He reached Jake just as a knife rose in the air. The man didn't stand a chance. Jake rolled over, gasping. "You never stopped saving me." By the time backup arrived, 3 attackers were down, 1 wounded, 1 missing. Jake limped back to the cabin, bleeding but alive. Maya helped him into a chair. Shadow sat beside them, chest heaving. Voss's team arrived minutes later, helicopters, drones, full tactical units. "You baited them," she said. Jake nodded. "And they bit." She smiled grimly. "Time to cut off the head." Part 6. Whispers in the Ashes. The warehouse burned 6 years ago. But in the ash, something had survived. Something that refused to be silenced. The charred skeleton of the warehouse stood like a war memorial. Blackened beams bent inward, steel warped by heat, foundations split like broken ribs. The smell of old smoke lingered even after all these years, trapped in the dirt, in the silence. Jake stepped forward slowly, the wind tugging at the collar of his jacket. His boots crunched through scattered glass and debris as he crossed into the shell of the building that had once nearly become his tomb. Shadow padded beside him, ears perked, nose twitching. Maya followed a few steps behind, camera in hand, eyes wide as she took in the graveyard of secrets. "This is where it happened?" she asked softly. Jake nodded. "Right there." He pointed to the collapsed corner. "That's where they set the trap." She raised her camera. "You ready to go on record?" Jake looked out over the wreckage, then back at her. "I've been off record too long." They filmed for hours. Jake walked her through every detail of the night he was left for dead. How the building was rigged with accelerants. How the call that led him there had been a setup. How he'd known something was wrong the moment Shadow froze at the door. They knew he'd smell it. That's why they planned for me to go in alone. They never expected Shadow to fight his way out. He paused. "Truth is, I was ready to die in here, but Shadow wasn't ready to let me." Maya swallowed hard. "And what happened after?" "I crawled to the back, found a storm drain, dragged myself through 30 feet of soot and sewage. I was half dead when I surfaced. I hid in a storage shed for 2 days. Then I went underground." She stopped filming. "And in all that time, you never once thought of reaching out?" "I did, 1,000 times. But I couldn't risk anyone I cared about. I knew they'd be watching my house, my friends, even Shadow." He looked down at the dog. He stayed, and somehow he waited. As the sun lowered, casting a long amber haze over the ruins, Shadow barked once and darted toward the collapsed section. Jake and Maya followed. Beneath the wreckage, Shadow had uncovered something, metal glinting under the ash. Jake dropped to his knees, brushing away soot. A fireproof lockbox. "Jesus," he muttered. "I forgot I even stashed this." He yanked it loose and opened it with his knife. Inside, a collection of burnt files, photographs, and at the bottom, a small black notebook wrapped in plastic. He opened the first page. The words were scrawled in blood. "If I'm dead, find her." Jake froze. Maya leaned closer. "Who's her?" Jake stared at the name on the next page. "Cassidy Wren." Maya's breath caught. "But she's dead. You said she disappeared after the first testimony." "She did," Jake said. "Or that's what I believed." He pulled out a half-burnt envelope. Inside was a photo Cassidy standing outside a motel holding a baby. It was dated 2 years ago. Jake's voice dropped. "She survived. She ran. And she has a child." Maya blinked. "We have to find her." Shadow barked again, short and focused. Jake stood. "She's the last piece. The one who can confirm everything. They'll kill to silence her." They left the warehouse with the evidence packed tightly in Jake's bag. Shadow remained tense the whole ride back to the safe house. When they arrived, Maya uploaded the video footage and burned copies of the recovered files onto 3 separate drives. Jake pinned Cassidy's photo to the corkboard. She worked evidence. She saw sealed reports, names, transfers, She knew too much, and she got out. Maya pulled up an old DMV database. I'll run the plate on the car in this photo, she said. See where it leads. Jake nodded. If she's alive, she'll be hiding deep. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, staring into the trees. The forest whispered around him. Leaves rustling, branches creaking like old voices. Shadow sat beside him. You knew, didn't you? Jake asked quietly. You knew she was still out there. Shadow didn't respond, but his eyes remained fixed on the road. At 3:43 a.m., Maya burst onto the porch, laptop in hand. I found her, she gasped. She's in Wyoming. Changed her name. Lives in a trailer under the name Harper Gray. Jake stood instantly. How sure are you? The birth certificate matches the hospital records. Same date. Same baby. Cassidy survived. She has a son. Jake looked down at Shadow. We leave at first light. The next morning, they packed light and headed west. It was a long drive, over 15 hours, but no one complained. They rotated behind the wheel, fueling up only at out-of-the-way stations. Shadow rode between them, occasionally whining, as if anxious to get there. Every hour, Maya checked for surveillance, drones, trackers, strange cars. Nothing. Either the syndicate didn't know what they were doing, or they were already waiting. They arrived at a dusty lot on the outskirts of Cheyenne. The trailer was old but clean. A swing hung from a tree. A red tricycle sat by the steps. Maya stayed in the car as Jake approached. Shadow followed closely, ears up. Jake knocked. No answer. He knocked again. The door opened slowly. Cassidy Wren stood in the doorway, face gaunt, eyes red, holding a shotgun. Jake raised both hands. Cassidy, my name is Jake Monroe. I'm not here to hurt you. You're supposed to be dead, she whispered. I was supposed to be, he said. But so were you. Her eyes flicked to Shadow. She dropped the gun. Get inside, she said. Now. Inside, Cassidy paced the small living room, hands shaking. Her son slept in the back room. Jake explained everything. How Maya had found the files, how Keller had fallen, how the syndicate was unraveling. Cassidy clutched the photo of herself and her son. I ran. I hid. I watched everyone I knew disappear. And now you're telling me I need to go back. Jake shook his head. No. I'm telling you it's time to end this. Cassidy handed him a file from a floor safe. It was a journal. Her own. She had documented every threat, every message, every surveillance truck, every voice on the phone telling her to keep quiet. At the end was a final entry. I believe Jake Monroe is still alive. And I believe if he is, he'll come for the truth. This is for him. Jake closed the book, jaw tight. You did good, Cassidy. They left with the journal, but not before arranging full protection for Cassidy and her son. Maya made the calls. Voss cleared the path. Cassidy would testify. Back on the road, Jake didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, She lived in fear for 6 years. For doing the right thing. Maya glanced at him. So did you. He looked at Shadow in the rearview mirror. Not him. He never feared. He just waited. Shadow's tail thumped softly. They returned to Ridgeline by nightfall. Outside the old police station, a new sign had been erected, under federal review. Jake stood at the edge of the steps and stared. He reached into his coat and pulled out his badge. Burned, cracked, but still whole. He set it on the steps, then turned to Maya. Next stop, D.C. We're not done until the last one falls. She smiled. Shadow barked once. The sun began to rise behind them. Part 7. The Man in the Woods. Some legends fade into whispers. Others keep walking. Hidden beneath the trees, carrying secrets even time refuses to bury. The wind howled over the ridgelines, tearing through the pines with a voice that carried stories too old for men to remember. It was colder here, colder and quieter. As Jake Monroe stepped onto the frozen forest floor of Crane's Hollow, he felt it in his chest. the weight of something unfinished. Shadow walked ahead of him, ears perked, eyes sharp. His paws made no sound on the frost-covered ground, and he moved like he knew the way, even though Jake had never brought him here before. Behind them, Maya kept her distance, camera packed but silent, hands gripping a set of folded thermal maps they had pulled from Cassidy Wren's hidden file. One mark had been circled in red ink. Crane's Hollow, Hunter's Cabin. Last reported movement, March. Jake had stared at the note for a long time before speaking. Cassidy wasn't the only one who survived. They reached the cabin by dusk. It looked abandoned, windows boarded, roof sagging under years of snow and storm. The porch was collapsed on one side, and a rusted rifle hung forgotten above the doorway. But the door was intact and locked. Jake stepped forward and knocked. No answer. Shadow sat at the base of the steps, nose twitching. Then came the sound, a faint click. A gun. Jake turned his head slowly toward the treeline. "I wouldn't," he said calmly. The man stepped out like a memory wrapped in snow and leather. He wore a parka, his face obscured by a thick beard and mirrored sunglasses. But the way he held his weapon, steady, one-handed, angled just above the chest, was military. Jake didn't reach for his sidearm. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "I just want to talk." The man didn't speak, but he lowered the rifle slightly. Shadow let out a single, deep bark. Recognition. The man froze. Then he stepped closer, removed his glasses. His left eye was white, blind from an old injury. His cheek bore the remnants of a stitched-up wound. But Jake knew him.
Bo Strickland.
The man grunted. "Didn't expect to hear my name again." Jake nodded slowly. "You were on the raid team. The one before mine. Last one to live through it," Strickland said. "Barely." Maya moved forward, cautious but curious. "You've been hiding out here all this time?" Strickland gave her a tired glance. "You think I had a choice?" Jake stepped forward. "We need your story. Your version." Strickland's jaw tightened. "And if I say no?" Jake looked at Shadow. "He waited 6 years for me. I'm not walking away now." They went inside the cabin. It was warmer than expected. A small wood stove burned low in the corner. There was no electricity, no running water, but everything had a purpose. A hunter's world. Quiet, calculated, safe. Strickland poured them hot water steeped with pine needles and something bitter. "It's not coffee," he said flatly, "but it'll keep you awake." He sat down heavily and stared into the fire. "I should have died with the rest of them." Jake sat opposite him. "But you didn't." "No," Strickland said. "I ran." He told them everything. 6 years ago, he had been part of the first team sent to investigate internal corruption. Not just Ridgeline, but across the state. LeClaire was already on their radar. So was Keller. But the syndicate moved first. They had a mole. My team was compromised before we hit the tarmac. Strickland described a midnight ambush. Sniper fire. Explosives rigged into the vehicles. His commander shot in the neck. 2 of his closest friends incinerated in an SUV. I made it out on instinct. Stumbled into a ranger's trail and disappeared before they could track me. He had been hiding ever since. "They won't stop," he said. "They'll keep crawling through every state, every town. They're not just a ring, they're a system now. A damn blueprint." Jake leaned forward. "But you have records." Strickland hesitated. Then he stood and walked to a trapdoor under the stove. He opened it slowly. Inside were boxes. Dozens of them. Photos. Documents. Logbooks. "I don't know who to trust," he said. "But your dog didn't flinch when I raised a rifle. So I figure I owe you a shot." They stayed in the cabin 2 nights, scanning, cataloging, transmitting what they could. Maya's laptop buzzed with activity as she synced the drives with encrypted satellite servers. "This is bigger than Ridgeline," she said. "Way bigger." Jake studied a photo from one of the boxes, Keller shaking hands with a congressman. The label on the back, Senator Royce, contact point, 2018. Politics. Jake said bitterly. Of course, Strickland added. They fund the syndicate, get favors in return. Votes, control, blackmail. Maya closed the laptop. Then the only way out is to go national. They left on the third morning. Strickland agreed to come with them under one condition. We take the long way. If they know you're alive, they'll be watching the highways. Jake nodded. We'll move like ghosts. Shadow jumped into the back seat without hesitation. By the second day of travel, tension returned like a shadow behind the wheels. Twice they passed black SUVs on rural roads. Once, Jake spotted a drone circling a farmhouse 10 miles from their rest stop. They changed cars, covered their tracks, switched routes. But by the time they crossed into Colorado, they knew they were being followed. It happened just outside of Boulder. A semi-truck veered into their lane. Strickland swerved hard, tires screeching, engine roaring. A van behind them accelerated. Maya shouted, "We've got tails!" Jake pulled out the radio and called their contact. "This is Monroe. Code red. We are exposed." The voice replied, "Copy. Fall back to waypoint Echo 6. Extraction ETA 20. But they weren't going to make it 20 minutes. The gunfire started at the edge of the canyon. Automatic. Close range. The windshield shattered. Shadow barked, sharp and fast, then leapt across the back seat, shielding Maya. Strickland drove through the guardrail and off-road down a steep slope. Branches slapped the windows. Rocks shot past the tires. They hit the bottom with a crunch. No one spoke. Then, "Everyone okay?" Jake asked. Maya coughed. "Still breathing." Shadow barked once. Strickland turned. "We've got one chance. There's an old trail that runs behind the canyon. They won't follow if we get to the ravine." "Then let's move," Jake said. The final stretch was chaos. They abandoned the car, hiked through brush and stone. Shadow led the way, his nose sharp, body low, tail straight. By the time they reached the rendezvous point, the black helicopters were already circling. But this time they weren't syndicate. They were federal. Voss met them on the tarmac. "Washington's listening," she said, "and they want your files." Jake handed her 3 drives and the last photo. "Start here," he said, "and be careful. They're in the Capitol, too." Voss nodded. "We've got your back." Jake turned to Shadow. "Let's finish what we started." Part 8. The reunion no one saw coming. Some bonds never die. They just wait for the right moment to return home. The plane landed quietly under the shroud of dusk. No lights, no markings, just a soft thud of tires against tarmac as the black government jet taxied toward a forgotten hangar on the edge of the Andrews Air Force Base. Jake Monroe didn't speak. He hadn't said a word since they left Boulder. The silence wasn't out of fear or exhaustion. It was something deeper, heavier, something even Maya couldn't name. Shadow sat beside him, gaze forward, muscles tight. Across from them, Agent Rachel Voss unbuckled her harness and stood. "DC's waiting," she said. "So is the nation. You ready?" Jake finally looked up. His face was calm, his voice quieter than ever. No one's ever ready for what's coming. They were escorted in an unmarked vehicle through back routes and barricades. The city lights of Washington, D.C. pulsed like distant stars beyond the tinted windows. But the roads they took were empty, silent. Voss handed Jake a secure folder. "You'll brief directly with the committee tomorrow. But tonight, there's someone who asked to see you." Jake opened the folder. A name, Eleanor Monroe. He blinked. "My mother." Voss nodded. "She never stopped calling. Every month. Every year." Jake stared at the name, the address. It had been years since he thought about her. He'd cut all contact when he went underground to protect her, he told himself. But part of him always feared she wouldn't forgive him for the silence. Shadow shifted, whining softly. Jake met his eyes. "She deserves to know the truth." They dropped him off a few blocks away. Quiet neighborhood. Red brick row homes lined with dogwood trees, their blossoms white under the moonlight. The house was small but well kept. A single porch light flickered above the front door. Jake stood there for a long moment before he knocked. Footsteps. Then the door opened. She looked older. Gray hair pulled into a bun. Wrinkles carved by worry and years. But her eyes, they were his. Jake! Her voice cracked like glass under a boot. He didn't answer. Couldn't. She reached out, hands trembling, and touched his face. "You're alive," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "I'm sorry," he choked. "I had to disappear." And then she pulled him into her arms. No words, just tears. Shadow stood beside them, tail wagging, as if he, too, recognized the scent of home. Inside, the house was warm, filled with the scent of baked bread and lilac. Photos lined the walls, Jake as a boy with his father before he passed. One photo was newer. Shadow, on the porch. A local paper's feature about the dog who never gave up. "I kept everything," Eleanor said, pouring tea with shaky hands. "Every clipping, every rumor. I knew in my bones you weren't gone. I wanted to come back," Jake said. "I just couldn't. They would have used you." She touched his hand gently. "I would have waited forever, just like he did." She looked at Shadow, who had curled up at her feet. Jake's voice cracked. "I owe you both everything." They stayed the night. Jake slept in his childhood room, unchanged, almost frozen in time. The posters on the wall, the faded quilt, the smell of old paperbacks and dust. He woke just after 3 a.m. to the sound of Shadow growling. Not at danger, but at the window. Jake stood. Outside, a figure. He rushed down the stairs, out the door, barefoot across the lawn. The figure turned. It was a man, limping, face gaunt, but familiar. Jake's breath caught. "Caleb." The man stopped. His brother. They hadn't spoken in 15 years. Caleb Monroe had joined the Marines, done 2 tours, and then vanished into the private sector. Jake had tried to reconnect after their father's funeral, but Caleb had already been swallowed by shadows, security contracts, overseas assignments, secrets even deeper than Jake's. Now here he stood under the street lamp, looking like a ghost dragged back from war. "I heard," Caleb said. "Didn't believe it until now." Jake stared. "Where the hell have you been?" Caleb shrugged. "Same place as you, running from ghosts." They stood in silence. Then Caleb pulled out a folded paper. "I found something. Thought you should see it." Jake unfolded it. A black and white photo. A syndicate meeting, officers, politicians, mercenaries. At the center, Senator Royce. And beside him, Jake felt his knees weaken. It was Chief Leclerc, only younger, and holding a child. "My son?" Jake asked, voice trembling. Caleb shook his head.
No.
"Hers. But this kid, he's in the system now. Moved up fast. Cyber division. Clean record. But he's been accessing deep files, yours mostly." Jake stared down at the boy in the photo. "What's his name?" Caleb's voice was cold. "Landon Royce. And he's the one they'll use next." The next morning, Jake and Maya met with Voss in a secure federal facility buried beneath the Capitol. She briefed them quickly. "Landon Royce is on the fast track for a top intelligence position. He's clean, smart, charismatic. But we've tracked his IP to unauthorized data pulls, classified case files. Shadow's file. Yours. Even Cassidy Wren's." Maya frowned. "He's looking for weaknesses." Jake nodded. "He's their insurance. Their new face." Voss handed him a folder. "We have one shot at exposing this. Royce is testifying at tomorrow's tech oversight hearing. If you confront him in front of the right people, we can stop the syndicate's next move." Jake looked at Shadow, then at Maya. "Then we go public. All of it." That night, Jake visited the National Memorial for Fallen Officers. His name was still on the wall, etched in stone. Detective Jake Monroe. OW, July 16, 2019. He stared at it in silence. Then, with a marker, he drew a single line through the middle of the inscription. "I'm not done yet." Shadow sat beside him, tail wagging slowly. Part 9. The real target. It was never just about taking him down, it was about replacing him. Quietly, permanently, and the last piece had already moved into place. Jake Monroe stood in the corridor beneath the Capitol, the weight of 6 years pressing down on his shoulders like body armor. The buzz of security radios echoed around him. Staffers passed in hurried silence, eyes on screens, minds on headlines. But Jake was thinking of only one thing: Landon Royce. The name had been a footnote once. The senator's son. Smart, clean record, tech prodigy. But now, thanks to the intelligence from his brother Caleb and Maya's digital forensics, the truth had started to bleed through the cracks. Landon Royce wasn't just a fast-track government hire. He was the syndicate's next puppet. And if they didn't stop him now, he wouldn't just bury the evidence. He would become the evidence. Jake, Maya, Shadow, and Agent Rachel Voss had set up a secure operations room 2 blocks from the hearing chamber. The walls were lined with screenshots, intercepted communications, and photos, including one blown-up image that made Maya's stomach twist every time she looked at it. It showed Landon Royce at age 16, standing next to Keller, Briggs, and Senator Royce at a private fundraiser. In the background, Chief Leclerc, barely visible, but unmistakably present. "He was being groomed," Maya said. "From the beginning." Jake stared at the board. "They never needed to kill me. They just needed to replace you," Voss added. "And he's your ghost." The tech oversight hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m. sharp. Landon would be giving a public testimony as part of a congressional panel about national cybersecurity infrastructure. Cameras, press, open session. That was the moment. Jake would be there. But so would they. Shadow wore a sleek black K9 vest, lighter than his original, designed for speed and mobility. He sat in the corner of the ops room, his eyes locked on Jake like a second conscience. Jake reached down, rubbed his ears. "You ready to finish this?" Shadow barked once, low and sharp. Voss looked over. "There's one more thing." She handed Jake a folder marked Senator Royce, sealed investigation. Jake opened it. It was worse than he expected. In the early 2000s, Royce had laundered millions through defense contracts, using shell companies tied to former intelligence officials, some of whom had since vanished. The money funded black site operations, kidnappings, blackmail, disappearances, all executed by private contractors that Royce's office had quietly approved. Every target had one thing in common. They had information. And the final target? Jake Monroe, signed off 6 months before the warehouse fire. The hit hadn't been a mistake. It had been ordered. "He tried to kill me," Jake said, voice flat. Voss nodded. "He tried to erase you." Maya stood slowly. "Then let's make sure the world knows." At 9:45 a.m., they arrived at the hearing chamber through a side entrance. Jake wore a dark suit, no tie. His badge was tucked in his coat, half-burned, barely legible, but real. Maya wore a press badge. Shadow walked between them. Landon Royce sat at the table in the front row, flanked by aides and national security advisors. His face was calm, confident, hair neatly parted, eyes fixed ahead. A silver pin gleamed on his lapel. Jake recognized it. The syndicate's original insignia, 3 lines, 1 serpent head, disguised now as a tech initiative logo. But Jake had seen it before, in blood. The hearing began. The chairwoman opened with standard remarks. Questions started with protocol, stats, oversight, threat prevention. Landon answered each one with crisp precision. Polished, perfect. But Jake wasn't listening to the words. He was watching the man's body language. And Shadow was watching something else entirely. The air, the room, the tension. Then, at exactly 10:31 a.m., Jake stood. The room turned. The chairwoman blinked. "Sir, this is a closed panel. I'm Detective Jake Monroe," he said. raising his badge, previously declared deceased. I have evidence that this panelist, Landon Royce, is connected to a covert domestic infiltration network known as the Syndicate. Gasps broke out. Reporters surged forward. Landon's calm broke for half a second. A flicker. A pulse. Then the smile returned. "Detective Monroe," he said smoothly. "It's an honor, if this isn't some elaborate stunt." Jake stepped forward, placed a hard drive on the table. "This contains sealed financial records, correspondence, and testimony linking your father's office to operations that attempted to assassinate federal agents, including me." The room erupted. Security moved toward Jake, but the chairwoman raised her hand. "Let him speak." Jake kept his voice steady. "You've been watching us, pulling files, running analytics on whistleblowers. We have the logs. You were the Syndicate's cleanup man, and now you're trying to take its place." Landon chuckled, but it was hollow. "Even if I had such access, you think I'd leave a trail?" Maya stepped forward. "We didn't find the trail," she said. "Your system engineer did. And she's turned over everything." Landon froze. The hearing went into recess. Jake, Maya, and Voss were pulled into a private chamber. An emergency federal order had been filed to freeze all Royce Foundation assets. Warrants were issued. Agents moved. Within an hour, Senator Royce was in custody. And Landon? Gone. "He walked right out the back," Voss said, pacing. "Like he knew it was coming." Jake clenched his jaw. "Because he did." Voss turned. "Then who warned him?" Shadow stood at the door, tense, ears alert. Jake looked at him. "Shadow knows." Maya opened her laptop, pulled surveillance from outside the chamber, froze the frame. There, a man in a federal jacket, clearly visible, holding the service exit door open. They zoomed in. Jake whispered, "Warren, a former internal affairs supervisor. Syndicate, still embedded." The chase was back on. They followed the signal to a black SUV headed toward the waterfront. Jake and Shadow rode in the lead vehicle, Maya and Voss behind. They caught up near the old Navy Yard. Landon was alone. He ran. Shadow chased. Down corridors, past rusted steel containers, across concrete echoes and sea-stained warehouses. Jake followed, gun drawn. Landon ducked into a freight elevator. Too late. Shadow lunged, teeth clamped on Landon's arm, dragging him down. Jake arrived seconds later. Landon looked up, bloodied, shaking. "You're already dead," he spat. Jake didn't move.
No.
"I waited." He placed the badge on Landon's chest. "And justice just caught up." That night, Jake stood at the Lincoln Memorial, staring out at the reflection pool. Maya stood behind him. "Is it over?" she asked. Jake shook his head. "But the worst part is." Shadow sat between them, silent, loyal, and for the first time in 6 years, peace. Part 10. The message he waited to deliver. For years, he waited in silence. Not for revenge, not even for justice, but to deliver one message. And now the world would hear it. The headlines spread across every major network by dawn. Senator Royce arrested amid national security scandal. Former officer declared dead. Returns with evidence that shakes Washington. K9 who never gave up becomes symbol of national reckoning. But Jake Monroe wasn't reading the news. He stood in front of the Ridgeline Town Hall, the building where it had all begun, where he and Shadow had reported for duty every day, where the photos of his memorial still hung in the lobby, covered now in cloth and silence. He reached out and removed the black shroud. Underneath, a framed portrait of him and Shadow, taken years ago. His badge gleamed in the sunlight. Shadow's eyes stared back, alert, proud. Behind him, Maya stood beside Voss, press files tucked under her arm. "It's time," Maya said softly. Jake nodded. They walked into the main chamber where the entire town council had gathered, along with community leaders, police officers, and every local reporter who had once called the story fiction. Jake stepped up to the podium. Shadow lay beside him. "This isn't a press conference," he began. "This is a correction." He paused, voice steady. "6 years ago, I went into a warehouse to close a case I believed would save lives. I was wrong. It wasn't just a bust. It was an execution. I was supposed to die that night, but I didn't." He looked down at Shadow. He made sure of it. He detailed everything. The syndicate's infiltration, Keller's betrayal, Leclerc's rise, Royce's control, and Landon, how the syndicate didn't need to erase heroes anymore. They just needed to replace them with more agreeable ones. But they underestimated the one thing they couldn't control. He looked at Shadow again. Loyalty. The room was silent. Jake stepped back. Maya moved forward. She opened a laptop, played a short montage of Shadow's story. The porch, the wait, the photo he nudged, the moment he stood up again. The final clip showed Jake's return, and Shadow rushing into his arms. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Later that day, the governor's office announced a national commendation. Shadow awarded the Medal of National Valor for unwavering loyalty in the face of abandonment, and for serving the truth long after the world had stopped listening. Jake placed the medal on Shadow's collar. "You earned this," he whispered. Shadow didn't move. He just leaned his head against Jake's leg. That night, they returned to the porch, the same place Shadow had waited every day for 6 years. But this time, he didn't sit alone. Jake sat beside him, a cup of coffee in hand, his badge finally restored. They watched the road together, no longer waiting, just watching. Weeks passed. Royce faced trial. Leclerc disappeared, rumored to have fled the country. Dozens of officials resigned. The syndicate fractured. But for Jake, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about the message. So he wrote it. With Maya's help, they turned the files into a memoir, a documentary, a movement, titled The Dog Who Waited. It aired nationally, and millions watched. The final scene showed a clip of Shadow at Jake's feet during the trial, calm, unshaken. The narrator, Jake's voice, said, "He didn't wait for justice. He didn't wait for orders. He waited for truth. For me. And when I returned, he delivered the message only a loyal heart can carry. We are not forgotten." 1 month later, Shadow lay on the porch at sunset, his head on Jake's boot. His breaths were slow. Jake felt it in his chest before he saw it. The quieting, the stillness, the long pause between one breath and the next. He knelt beside him, tears already falling. "You held on until it was done," Jake whispered. He pressed his forehead to Shadow's. "Rest now. You brought me home." Shadow let out one final sigh, and was gone. They buried him in the backyard, beneath the oak tree where he used to chase squirrels before he became a soldier. The town came out in full uniform. Maya read a passage. Jake stood silent. But later that night, he wrote one final line at the end of the memoir. "This isn't a story about death. This is a story about a dog who waited, and about a man who was worth waiting for, because his dog never gave up on him." Epilogue. 1 year later, Jake Monroe walked into a K-9 training facility in North Carolina. A litter of pups yipped and bounced behind a gate. One of them, coal-black with deep, steady eyes, sat apart from the others. Watching, waiting, Jake crouched down. The pup approached, silent, and rested its head against his knee. Jake smiled. "Well, damn," he whispered. "You found me again, didn't you?" He picked the pup up gently, looked into its eyes, and knew